Human history is shaped not only by the noise we create, but also by the quiet moments we ignore. For thousands of years, our ancestors survived by listening to the forest, to the wind, to the subtle signals that determined life or death. Yet in the modern world, we have surrounded ourselves with constant distraction, drowning out the very awareness that once made us wise. Today, I want to invite you to rediscover an ancient technology, one that requires no electricity, no algorithms, and no updates. Silence. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of attention. When we allow the noise to fade, the mind begins to perceive patterns, emotions, and truths that were always there, waiting patiently. In silence, we see more about ourselves, about others, and about the reality we are all creating together. This speech is not about escaping the world. It is about understanding it more deeply. And to do that, we must learn to see more in silence. When we choose silence, we enter a realm that human beings have been running away from for centuries. It is almost paradoxical. In a world that celebrates intelligence, progress, and noise, the most profound insights often emerge when the noise fades away. Silence is not a luxury for monks, hermits, or philosophers. It is a biological necessity, a cognitive reset, a doorway to perception that modern life has nearly sealed shut. And this doorway, once walked through with intention, reveals that our senses are far more capable, our awareness far more expansive, and our understanding of reality far deeper than we ever imagined. To see more in silence is to realize how much of life we miss when we are speaking, thinking, planning, or reacting. It is to discover that the world is constantly communicating with us, even when we are not communicating back. In silence, the mind begins to notice subtleties that previously existed only as background blur. The breath, entering and leaving the lungs, becomes a complex orchestra of sensation. The simple act of standing becomes an exploration of gravity, balance, and presence. The visual field, once narrowed by distraction, expands into full panoramic awareness. We often believe that sight is limited by the capacity of the eyes, but in truth, sight is limited by the clutter within the mind. When the inner chatter softens, perception sharpens. You begin to see how people hold their emotions in their posture, how tension lives in certain rooms and harmony in others, how nature moves with intention, and how your own thoughts rise and fall like weather patterns. Silence becomes a teacher, revealing that every moment carries information we usually fail to decode. This heightened perception is not mystical. It is cognitive science in action. The brain is constantly filtering reality, deciding what deserves attention and what does not. Most of the time, the filter is clogged with noise, notifications, conversations, worries, impulses, desires, fears. When noise dominates, the filter can no longer distinguish what is meaningful from what is irrelevant. Silence cleans the filter. It allows the mind to recalibrate and reorganize, to see patterns that were previously invisible, to identify connections between events, emotions, and actions. This shift is why people who sit in silence often describe moments of clarity as if a fog has lifted. The fog was never outside, it was in the mind. Silence simply reveals what has always been there. Silence also transforms time. In noise, time feels fragmented, rushed, constantly slipping away. Silence stretches time in a way that modern life rarely allows. 1 minute of silence can feel like an hour, not because time slows, but because our awareness expands. When there is no noise, every second becomes a space large enough to explore. You begin to realize that most of your life has been lived on fast forward without your consent. Silence grants the gift of experiencing the present moment in its actual depth. You see more in silence because silence gives you more time to see. But silence is not only about perceiving the external world differently, it is equally about perceiving yourself differently. Most people spend their days reacting, responding to messages, solving problems, dealing with responsibilities, engaging in conversations. This constant engagement prevents them from meeting themselves. Silence removes the external stimulus long enough for the inner world to emerge. You begin to witness the architecture of your thoughts, the emotional signatures that drive your decisions, the memories that still influence your behavior, the fears you have never acknowledged, and the desires you rarely admit. Without silence, these forces operate behind the scenes, shaping life without your awareness. With silence, they step into the light, and once you see them, you can understand them, question them, and eventually master them. This self-awareness is uncomfortable at first. Silence strips away the illusions that noise helps maintain. Noise gives us escape routes: music to drown discomfort, conversation to avoid introspection, entertainment to avoid boredom, information to avoid uncertainty. Silence removes the escape routes. It reveals the truth of how restless, impulsive, and often fragmented the mind really is. Many avoid silence because they fear this confrontation. But within this confrontation lies transformation. The human mind cannot grow if it is always occupied. It grows when it is allowed to observe itself, reflect upon itself, and reorganize itself. Silence creates the conditions for this internal evolution. Once the mind begins to settle, silence opens the door to a deeper level of intelligence, one that is not analytical, but perceptive, intuitive, and holistic. You begin to notice not only what is happening, but why it is happening. You begin to sense undercurrent in conversations, motivations behind behaviors, and patterns in your own emotional responses. This is not guesswork or imagination. It is the mind operating with reduced interference. When noise decreases, intuition increases, because intuition is the brain's ability to integrate vast amounts of subtle information that words cannot express. In silence, the brain becomes an antenna, receiving signals from reality with far greater accuracy. Silence also enhances creativity in a fundamental way. Creativity does not emerge from chaos, it emerges from space. Ideas need room to breathe, to collide, to evolve, to connect with other ideas. When the mind is overloaded, creativity suffocates. But in silence, ideas float freely. They combine in unexpected ways. New perspectives form. Solutions appear without force. Silence becomes the incubator for innovation. Many breakthroughs in science, art, and philosophy were born not from intense activity, but from quiet contemplation. Even today, when individuals step away from the noise, into nature, into solitude, into silence, they often return with renewed creativity and clarity. Silence reconnects us with the parts of the mind that noise has muted. On a broader scale, silence helps us see the unseen structures of society. It reveals how much of our behavior is shaped by social conditioning, how much noise comes from expectations placed upon us, how much of what we consider our thoughts are simply echoes of the world around us. When you sigh, T. In silence, you begin to notice how deeply society has influenced your desires, fears, and identity. This awareness is liberating. It gives you the power to choose which influences to accept and which to reject. In silence, you recover the agency that noise steals. You begin to act from intention rather than reaction, from clarity rather than confusion. Silence also reveals the emotional undercurrents of life. When you are quiet, you begin to see the emotions of others more clearly. You notice the subtle changes in tone, the small expressions in the eyes, the energy people carry with them. You begin to understand not just what people say, but what they mean. Silence allows you to listen without preparing a response, without judgment, without defensiveness. This type of listening transforms relationships. It creates deeper connections, greater understanding, and genuine empathy. People feel seen when they are listened to in silence. They feel valued, respected, understood. Silence becomes a form of presence that words cannot match. When we look at nature through silence, a different world appears. The forest is no longer background scenery, it becomes a living system with rhythms, intelligence, and communication. The wind carries patterns, the birds follow signals, the trees interact in ways that only silence reveals. In silence, nature becomes a teacher, showing us how to exist with balance, patience, and awareness. Modern life has distanced us from this natural wisdom. Silence reconnects us to it. Even the body begins to speak in silence. You notice tensions you have been ignoring, fatigue you have been suppressing, signals of hunger or thirst you have been overriding with distraction. The body becomes an ally instead of an afterthought. You begin to live from a place of alignment, mind, body, and environment moving together instead of in conflict. This alignment brings stability, centeredness, and resilience. You see more in silence because silence integrates the fragmented parts of your being. Another profound dimension of silence is that it reveals the impermanence of everything. When you sit quietly, you watch thoughts arise and dissolve, emotions swell and fade, sensations appear and disappear. You begin to understand that nothing within the mind is permanent. This realization reduces fear, because fear feeds on the illusion of permanence. Silence teaches you that emotions, worries, and thoughts are like waves, they come and go. You do not need to identify with them. You simply observe them. This perspective allows you to navigate life with greater calm and less attachment. You become less reactive and more responsive. Silence makes you see the temporary nature of your inner storms. As silence deepens, you also begin to notice how noise shapes your identity. Much of who you believe you are is constructed from external input, praise, criticism, expectations, comparisons. Silence removes those inputs long enough to reveal a deeper identity, beyond labels. This identity is not defined by achievements, appearances, or roles. It is defined by awareness itself. You see yourself not as a collection of stories, but as the one who observes the stories. This shift can be life-changing. It brings freedom from the pressures of self-image and the constant performance society demands. In silence, you meet yourself without masks. Silence also changes your relationship with the future. Most anxiety stems from trying to predict or control what has not yet happened. But in silence, you see that the future is not something you can grasp. It is a series of possibilities shaped by present choices. When you are grounded in silence, you stop trying to mentally live tomorrow. You return to the moment where life is actually occurring. This presence reduces anxiety not by eliminating uncertainty, but by accepting it. You begin to understand that clarity comes from stillness, not from overthinking. Silence becomes a compass, guiding your actions from a place of stability rather than fear. At the societal level, silence holds immense power. Movements, revolutions, and discoveries are often preceded by silent reflection. People come together not only through shared words, but through shared quiet understanding. Silence reveals collective truths, truths about inequality, truth about injustice, truths about human behavior. That noise can easily distort. In a world where information is weaponized and narratives compete for dominance, silence helps us step back and discern what is real. Silence is not passive, it is the birthplace of thoughtful action. Another insight that silence reveals is the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the feeling of being disconnected. Solitude is the experience of being deeply connected to oneself, to nature, to awareness. Many fear silence because they confuse it with loneliness. But once you step into silence with openness, you realize that solitude is nourishing. It strengthens your sense of self, enhances your resilience, and gives you the emotional independence to engage with the world without losing yourself. Silence transforms solitude into a source of power. When silence becomes a regular part of life, even small moments take on new meaning. A simple walk becomes a meditation. A cup of tea becomes a sensory journey. A conversation becomes a profound exchange. Silence enriches experience by sharpening presence. You no longer rush through life, you inhabit it. The ordinary becomes extraordinary because you are fully awake to it. Seeing more in silence is ultimately about reclaiming a dimension of human experience that has been overshadowed by constant noise. It is about rediscovering the depth of perception, the richness of awareness, the intelligence that emerges when the mind is not overloaded. It is about meeting reality without filters, meeting yourself without distortion, meeting others with true presence. Silence is not the absence of life, it is the way to experiencing life more fully. When the mind is constantly bombarded with external input, it becomes a battlefield. Thoughts collide, emotions surge unpredictably, and impulses demand immediate attention. Most people believe they are thinking clearly, but in truth, their decisions are the products of fragmented attention, unresolved feelings, and unconscious reactions. Inner chaos is not a rare phenomenon, it is the default condition of a mind immersed in the endless noise of modern life. Messages arrive, notifications buzz, obligations multiply, and the mind responds reflexively. We imagine we are acting with control, but our behavior is often dictated by habits, fears, desires, and distractions that operate beneath awareness. Silence is the counterbalance. It is the force that restores order, transforms confusion into insight, and converts reactive behavior into deliberate action. The transformation begins not by doing, but by being. To experience silence is to step out of the current of distraction long enough to see the currents themselves, to understand the hidden patterns, and to realize the sources of your inner turbulence. Chaos is an unavoidable part of being human. The mind is a complex system designed to handle multiple streams of information simultaneously. But it was never designed to function under constant overload. When the mind is crowded with competing demands, worries about the future, regrets about the past, projections of imagined scenarios, it loses its capacity for coherence. Thoughts overlap, priorities blur, and the boundary between important and trivial collapses. In this state, action becomes reactive, emotional, and often destructive. Decisions are made to alleviate immediate discomfort rather than to align with long-term purpose. Silence interrupts this pattern. By intentionally creating space without input, without distraction, without judgment, the mind begins to disentangle itself. The storm subsides not because external conditions change, but because internal clarity emerges. The practice of silence is not mere inactivity. It is active observation. When the mind is silent, it observes its own activity. Thoughts rise and fall like waves. Emotions flare and fade. Impulses appear and dissolve. In this observation, one begins to see the mechanisms of the mind at work, which thoughts are habitual, which emotions are reactive, which impulses are conditioned by fear or desire. This witnessing does not require analysis, argument, or judgment. It simply notices. And noticing is transformative. Awareness alone begins to calm the turbulence because the mind no longer identifies fully with every passing thought or feeling. Silence creates a gap between stimulus and reaction. In this gap lies choice. In this gap lies intentional action. Chaos is no longer a master, clarity becomes the guide. Silence also reveals the invisible connections between thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Many people act without recognizing the chains of cause and effect that lead from internal turbulence to external action. An anxiety about the future produces hurried decisions. Frustration with another person produces harsh words. Unacknowledged fear produces avoidance. In silence, these connections become visible. You begin to notice patterns, recurring thoughts that trigger certain emotions, repeated emotional responses that drive predictable behaviors, subtle cognitive distortions that shape perception. This is not speculation, it is observation grounded in direct experience. The mind begins to organize itself because it can finally perceive the structure that previously went unnoticed. Chaos becomes intelligible, confusion becomes discernible, and once the structure is understood, clarity becomes achievable. The transition from chaos to clarity is also a shift in